Hello, my friends.
Hello.
It's my great pleasure to have a conversation today with Allan Combs. And the book is called Consciousness Explained Better Towards an Integral Understanding of the Multifaceted Nature of Consciousness. And you will see Allan's bio at the bottom of this interview. He's very well known, and he's been in charge of the Society for Consciousness Studies. And before we get into the book, and as I mentioned, you can check his bio at the bottom of this interview and a link to his book as well. But before we start, Allan, in preparation for this conversation, I went back to looking at this. Okay,
Yes.
which you say, Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained is frequently referred to as Consciousness Explained Away. But I also actually looked at my library on some very interesting books on consciousness. Here's one, Liberating Mind from the Tyranny of Materialism. And here's another very scholarly manual edited by several people, is Consciousness Primary. So I was going through your book just now, and I also noted that you and Ken Wilber have been friends and colleagues for a long time. Why did you write this book, Allan?
Well, let me say briefly something about the other two books you mentioned. I have a website called Best Books, in which I list what I consider the best books on consciousness beyond the brain. And those two books you mentioned were right at the top of my list, and there are 4 or 5 others. So at the end, after this meeting, I will look up the URL and send it to you, because they're all listed, and those are really important books I think you mentioned.
Yeah, I actually noticed that you had included You Are the Universe in that list as well.
Yes, some prominent authors for that one.
Well, thank you so much. So why did you write this book, Allan?
Well, obviously, I've been interested in consciousness for a long time, and Ken Wilber and I have been friends, although I haven't really kept up with him much in the last few years, but we go way back. And he actually suggested that I could write a book that might be more accessible than he would write, and encouraged me to write the book. And at the time, we had a publisher. So I wrote the book. And the book is, while I am a dear friend of Ken's and a great admirer of his theory, I'm not an accolade. And so this book was really written with several intentions in mind. Well, the first of which was to deliver Ken's own work and his own theory about consciousness in an accessible, open way. I wrote that book about 10 years ago, and I haven't written a book since, but I put everything into that book that I knew at the time about good writing and accessibility. From the length of the book to the way I organized it, to the writing style. So there was a lot in that book. In fact, I'm probably going to teach a little course in the near future on writing, and I may use this book as a model. Because I put so much into it. So I wrote the book, and Ken, of course, gave me a nice endorsement. He said, the finest book on consciousness in modern times, bar none. Well, you can't beat that. Although I did get a nice endorsement on the back, as you can see, from Michael Murphy as well, who I saw quite a bit of when I was in California. Michael is a co-founder of Esalen Institute. So that's how the book got written. And
Allan, I've been reading the book, and of course, Michael Murphy and Ken Wilber are friends too. And I have to congratulate you, because it is indeed a very deep, integral understanding of what you say in the subtitle, the multifaceted nature of consciousness. Let me share with you my understanding of consciousness, see if you agree. As you know, we both go to conferences where people forever talk about consciousness and mind without ever defining it. So the way I understand consciousness from Eastern wisdom traditions, it's only one word: self-awareness is consciousness, or awareness itself. Awareness, or that in which all experience occurs, that in which all experience is known, and out of which all experience is made, including the experience that we call the physical body or the physical world. So when we use the word consciousness, to me, it's the knowing element in every experience that any sentient being has. Would you agree with that definition?
Well, I generally agree with that, and you emphasized the knowing element. And as you know, in deep Indian philosophy, there's a noetic aspect to consciousness. There's a sense of knowing, of ownership and knowing to it, and I agree with what you're saying. The word consciousness, as you know, and I wrangle about this in the book quite a bit. It is a difficult word, and people tend to objectify it and talk about it as if it's a thing. And William James is my great hero in this area, and he, somewhere in the middle of his life, pretty much rejected the word consciousness. People thought he'd given up on the whole project of understanding the inner life, but he didn't. He said people just reify it. They talk about it as an object. And so James, from then on, only talked about experience. And in this book, as you know, in the first few pages, I make this distinction that I'll use the word consciousness, but when I'm really talking about the experience itself, what you're talking about, the sense of being, that experience is the word I prefer. Although I don't object to using the word like, social consciousness, or conscious of this or conscious of that, meaning awareness. But yeah, I think you and I basically agree. The question of whether consciousness is the ground for everything, including the material world, is really a difficult one. And I'm not really quite prepared to make the call on it. But it's as believable as anything. As you know, many of the great physicists have basically said when we're done with everything, the one thing we have left is awareness or consciousness or experience. Yeah, I think we are fairly aligned in our sense of what consciousness is.
So as we look at the history of thought around the subject, and I don't want to oversimplify, but there's the one monism which says matter only. And the problem with that monism is no one can really explain how atoms and molecules learned to think. So that's what is called the hard problem of consciousness, the matter only monism. Then there's the consciousness only monism. And then there is, of course, Descartes with what we call dualism. Now, I'm told by scientists that dualism is out. It doesn't explain even how I lift my arm or how I speak. If mind and matter are two different things, how is the interaction mediated? And furthermore, my scientist friends tell me that dualism violates the laws of thermodynamics, that, what is the agent? What is communicating mind to matter? How do I lift my arm or speak or do anything that we call motor activity, but also sensory activity? The dance of atoms and molecules can't explain it, and nor can dualism. So we're left with consciousness only monism. And you just use the word experience. So when I look at some of the new non-dualists talking about the direct method, and I'm, been practicing it myself, the direct method is looking at raw experience and before we give it a meaning. So raw experience is basically sound, touch, sight, taste, smell, those five senses, which is a very narrow bandwidth of experience, considering that other species have different forms of raw experience. But then we give it meaning, and then it becomes a perception in a sense. The sound becomes a poem, the sound becomes a word, the sound becomes music. The colors and shapes and forms become so-called objects of our perception. But if we analyze this process a little bit carefully, all we are experiencing is a narrow bandwidth of I would say electromagnetic activity, maybe gravity along with that. But even those are human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in human consciousness, which is very species specific. And now this brings us to the whole understanding of what some scientists are calling naive realism or scientific realism, which is based on subject-object split, but which is also based on the idea that the so-called objective world is exactly what it is, perceived by the five human senses, and that if we disappeared, then the objective world would still exist as we perceive it. That's pretty naive, but it does help us do science and create all these technologies that we use now to communicate, and everything from jet planes to the new technologies of the internet and quantum physics all depend on these constructs. But are we actually living already in a virtual reality that we call the physical universe? And is our body part of that process? Is this universe that we call the universe an entirely human construct for sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, which are modified forms of the self? That's what the Vedanta would say anyway. One simple statement: you and the universe are awareness. Now, does that mean this phone is made of modalities of awareness? Well, the only way I know it is through modalities of awareness. The rest is concepts. So is awareness and its modifications all there is? Or do you have a different perspective? As I read your book, you talk about modes of consciousness, integration, but fundamentally, do you believe that consciousness is the ground state of all experience in all species?
Well, it's a good question, and I wish I could answer it. I'm not ready to throw monism out the window yet. I claim to, or I mean, throw dualism out the window yet. I claim to be a dualist on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And the great brain scientist Sir John Eccles, was a dualist. He sort of had an almost approach similar to Descartes, but he somehow had snuck in some quantum physics to explain how the mind acts on the body and vice versa. It's a good question. I don't know. I think consciousness is sort of, Bertrand Russell once said, I would probably be a physicalist if there were any evidence for it. Any evidence for physical matter, because as you know, as you push it further and further, you get down to energy, and then you get down to processes, and then you get down to mathematical equations, which is why Heisenberg wrote an essay years ago, what he called the new idealism. What's really real, from a physicist's point of view, what's really real are these equations in somebody's mind. So I don't really know the answer, but I do believe I am a panpsychist. I think Ken Wilber and I both have since the beginning. And, panpsychism used to be really out the window at the Tucson conferences. They'd give us a little back room. But now David Chalmers and a lot of other people are becoming panpsychists, because where does the experience come from? Seems to be right there. And Rupert Sheldrake even has given some fascinating talks on which he, I won't say argues for, but suggests that any self-organizing complex system that can know itself might well be conscious. And he includes the sun. There's a whole essay, a technical essay on the sun as a possible conscious being. So I'm not sure where I'm at with all that, but I do believe consciousness is a kind of ground of everything. It's there. The really question is, how does it get organized into minds and into interactions? As you know, I'm interested in human consciousness and where it's going in the future. And I'm seeing more and more of a movement towards understanding consciousness as something that's a broad base for all different kinds of experiences and which connect people like you and I talking right now in a kind of a fundamental way. I think a lot of the connections between people, the experience of being together was sort of trashed by the behaviorists who wanted to explain it all in terms of stimulus and responses. But no, I think there's something deeper that connects us. And I don't disagree with you. I just, I sort of have a lot of different ideas. And as I said, I'm not pushing any of them, but I do think consciousness is a fundamental in this universe. I'm a panpsychist. I think consciousness is somehow like the water that fish live in. We're unaware of it because it's so much of everything. And it seems like historically we have come over the centuries, although if you look at Indian thought, it was much older, of becoming aware of it, aware of the water in a sense of who we are and what we are. And I talk about that quite a bit in the book, I guess. Also, to respond to one or two of your comments a little bit more, I do agree that, of course, how can you deny it, that most of our experience comes through the senses. But I also want to point out that despite I'm a sensory psychologist actually by training, so I'm very aware of how the eye and the ear, for example, put the stimuli together and give us the experience of vision and sound and organize things. And you have some very nice pictures that show how visually you can see the same object in different ways, depending upon how your sensory system acts on it. But one of the things, as you know, I emphasize throughout this book is how the whole process of understanding reality, what's real, changes for us as we grow up, as we mature, from childhood through adolescence, through adulthood, and then on into old age. So there are a lot of different ways to experience the world that we live through. In fact, if we're fortunate enough to live to be as old as you and I are, the process moves forward, and I think it moves forward historically as well. So I guess I'm just rambling here, but that's my response to some of the things you've said.
But Leslie, just going back to the word panpsychism, because I know it's the fashion of the day, including David Chalmers, but panpsychism assumes the existence of a substance called matter. And, you know, it says mind and matter, inseparably one, and aspects of consciousness everywhere, including the sun and so on. But isn't matter just a human name for modalities of experience through the five human senses and how we understand them? So, you know, I would go beyond panpsychism to say there's only consciousness, and matter is a human construct for a modality of awareness, modes of knowing and awareness. And therefore, when we talk about theology, physics, biology, mathematics, these came after. I mean, you know, consciousness, you need consciousness to do theology or philosophy or science. So the very word science of consciousness is kind of misleading because science is an activity in human consciousness. Do you make a distinction between consciousness only monism and panpsychism?
Well, I guess I have to admit that I think of panpsychism a little differently. And I don't know that David Chalmers or some of the authorities would agree with me. I'm not trying to make any point with it. But all I mean by that is consciousness is a potential that seems to permeate all of existence. And I don't tie it to the material world at all necessarily. You're right, it's become the fashion. It's interesting how quickly that happened. Because, I've been going to those big Tucson meetings since the very first one. Panpsychism, if it got even a small room in the back of the house, was lucky up to, 6 or 8 years ago, maybe even 5. I think when David Chalmers came out here about 5 years ago and said, well, panpsychism is a plausible hypothesis, suddenly the whole thing flipped. But I think of consciousness as a kind of more like a potential that permeates all of existence in a sense. And it's sort of like we're living in a sea of consciousness. And, William James made some wonderful metaphors from that we're like islands in the ocean, connected underneath, but separate on top. But I guess that goes beyond just the idea of consciousness. But I agree with you that consciousness seems to permeate all of existence as a potential. And it seems like it gets organized into minds and into living beings as they become more organized and are able to sustain the structure. Although saying that, I'm not saying that I think you have to have a physical brain and mind to be conscious, because I don't. I think there's lots of evidence for consciousness beyond the body, which is some of the books you were showing there. And even Stuart Hameroff, who's deals with quantum physics in the brain all the time, has made some pretty positive statements about the possibility of consciousness existing in some sort of quantum field beyond the brain. Of course, he ties it down to physics all the time, but I'm not sure I'm willing to do that. I just know consciousness goes beyond the physical in some situations.
The more I look, part of my training is, of course, neuroscience and neuroendocrinology. And so I know I've studied the neural correlates of experience, but it's very obvious, isn't it, that there is no experience in the brain. I mean, the brain, you can cut a knife through the brain and it doesn't feel its own self. Moreover, we experience colors, shapes, forms, sounds. There's nothing of the sort in the brain. There's no sound in the brain, no color in the brain, no taste, electrochemical activities, which in turn are, again, human constructs for modes of knowing and experience in awareness. The brain is an experience in awareness as well. So it gets very confusing when we try to say that the brain is the source of experience, or in fact, the brain is another modality of consciousness, and it's pretty species specific. And what we call laws of nature are regularities of human experience. Not that other species don't have regularities of experience, but their experiences are very different from us. And this begs the question, is there such a thing as the real physical world, or are we just making it up?
Well, let me answer that in two different ways. One of them is you're addressing a very old question, and that is the brain a transmitter, or does it create consciousness, or does it transmit consciousness? And of course, I lean in the latter direction because, as you said, the brain is not conscious in and of itself, and consciousness in some ways exists outside of the brain. What was the second part, though, that you just mentioned?
No, I was just saying that the brain itself is an experience, the human name for a particular mode of knowing and experience through the five senses. So, in the Eastern wisdom traditions, consciousness is the observer, the mode of observation, and that which is observed all simultaneously as potential. So, as you just said,
Are you referring to the wonderful metaphor of what is it, the poem of the two birds?
yes, the words, the one bird is eating the fruit of action, the other is watching the second bird, the twin
Yes,
bird.
and we're the second bird. We're both birds, I guess. But there is a kind of dualism that appeals to me a lot, and that's between the Prakriti and the Purusha.
I accept that the Prakriti is just a fluctuation of Purusha. You see, as sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, Purusha is modifying itself as experience and can only do it by turning itself into observer, process of observation, and that which is observed simultaneously. But Purusha is the pure potential, and Prakriti is the becoming, the being that becomes this experience.
But
In
this
that
is so
model.
subtle, so beautiful and so subtle. It's such a poetic way of saying what Alan Watts used to say. Consciousness is the universe eyeing itself. And then he used a double meaning of the word I. It's a universe eyeing itself. And I agree with that. And I don't know just what the process is, but I think it's a beautiful way to look at what's going on.
As we enter these final stages of our existence, obviously, these questions become much more important. I've been now doing some studies along with other cognitive scientists and neuroscientists on psychedelics, looking at what is called the terminal lucidity, where people go beyond this space-time and matter, experience themselves as non-local beings, even have communication with the so-called dead, but there's extreme clarity and they lose the fear of death. And, as I'm looking at these experiences, some that I'm assisting and some that I'm becoming more aware of, it's, at least to me, it seems that what we call fundamental reality is not in space-time, only experience is in space-time. And the essential religious experience is knowing yourself as non-local, the emergence of Platonic values like truth, goodness, beauty, harmony, love, compassion, joy, equanimity, and finally, the loss of the fear of death. These all go together if we understand ourselves fundamentally as the potential for observer, observing, and observed, knower, knowing, and known, seer, seeing, and scenery.
Well, 100 years ago, a lot of people understood, I think, much more about the process of dying than they do today, because people die in hospitals under bright lights and using medications that keep them not very clear, whereas there are all sorts of phenomenon associated with death that used to be much better known. For example, the light appears in the room, can be seen down the hall when somebody's dying. And this person will, and we see this today, of course, and studies of this sort of thing and working with dying people, they'll talk to deceased relatives like they're right there in the room, and then they'll talk to you. They're not out of, maybe this is a person that's been very unclear in their own mind, and maybe Alzheimer's, who knows what, but they're clear now. And they're talking to you in their room, and then they're turning to talking to some being that you can't see. But I think more and more people, thoughtful people, physicists as well as physicians, have begun to think of multiple realities. And I don't know what to say about this, but certainly the experiences people have, near-death experiences, dying experiences, even dreams and psychedelic experiences, find themselves in a cosmos in which time doesn't flow the way it does. for us in the physical universe. I have a lot of trouble with this because I was trained in science like everybody else in my own culture, but there's more to the universe than what you see in front of you when you're wide awake and in a sober state, as it were. So that's part of what interests me a lot, and part of what I talk about in this book a lot. I don't talk much about dying and that sort of thing, but I do talk about the fact that there are many states or kinds of consciousness, and reality is different in different ones. And all you have to do is take a couple of tokes of marijuana to figure that out, or alcohol. I always said that alcohol was an underrated psychedelic drug. I guess because in my youth I liked it so well. But these are different realities, and some of them are not physical. So when people start working with powerful psychedelic drugs, as I'm sure you know, from your own research, like ayahuasca, for example, they move out of the universe that we're normally living in. And yeah.
My very special guest today has been Allan Combs. Look up his biography underneath the URL. The book is called Consciousness Explained Better: Towards an Integral Understanding of the Multifaceted Nature of Consciousness. Allan, this is a book that has actually been very interesting to read. It gives me more questions now about multiple dimensions of reality. I've also been recently reading Caltech Professor Sean Carroll's book, Something Deeply Hidden, and he posits infinite universes.
Well, that's who I was thinking of, actually, but I'm very bad with names, so I couldn't remember. Thank you.
Yeah, no, so he posits, but now, if you read the Yoga Vishishta, it says the same thing, other than it says,
I have read it, but it's been many years.
And he says the same thing: infinite universes come and go in the vast expanse of consciousness, like motes of dust dancing in a beam of light. And that's, in a way, liberation from even the mystery of death. If there are infinite dimensions, then birth and death could be just another human construct for modes of experience in this dimension.
Yes.
Much to think about, my friend.
Thank you so much. We have very much in common, I think.
I think so. So please look up this book. You'll be astonished, bewildered, and have many more questions than you had. And as we explore the known, the unknown becomes even more mysterious. Thank you, Allan.
Thank you, my friend.